And we are live. Welcome everybody to Lubbock Compact Live for Wednesday, November 3rd. This is the first one of the month.
Woo.
And we are back. We have some updates. Of course, I am your host, Adam Hernandez, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Nick Bergfeld. And so we have some updates on the bond election situation. And then after that, we are continuing our conversation about the proposed closing of Dupre Elementary in the heart of Lubbock neighborhood. And so there's a lot to talk about there. We've had a meeting that took place this past Monday. And so there's a lot to talk about there. And so I guess we can go ahead and kick it off with the bond election updates.
All right. So just to start with the numbers. So just the other day on Tuesday, Lubbock citizens voted yes or no for a $175 million bond package, the most controversial component of which was a $40 million allocation for downtown. So when the total numbers came in, we ended up with 54% of voters being against the bond election and 46% being in favor of the bond election. In total, about 17,978 people voted in this election, which comes out to a little bit under 10% of registered voters in Lubbock County and is actually about average for an election without any elected officials on the ballot. So we clocked in at about a typical turnout for one of these types of elections. And so from the perspective of Lubbock citizens, in terms of the percentages there, that was a pretty big no to the bond election. And there's a couple different reasons that we've been hearing and getting feedback from people in the community as to why they felt as though that this bond election didn't make a lot of sense. And Adam, I'm kind of curious, what have you been hearing from folks as to why they voted against it? And full disclosure, as the Lubbock Compact, we supported voting for the bond election because of the necessity that many of the roads that were included in it were distributed throughout the city of Lubbock. There was a fairly fair distribution of it. But the challenge, I think, became many people didn't see it that way, didn't see that it was a fair distribution and didn't feel that that was the case.
Yeah, so there was actually three main things, and one of them is really specific to a certain area. And so that would be, I'll start with that one because it was the Broadway section that was proposed. Mm-hmm. And there were different sides on that Broadway issue in that area. But by far the loudest were the ones opposed to it. And there were a few reasons for that. And depending on who you would talk to, those reasons would be different. But a lot of that opposition came from folks who were actually near Broadway. And so the other two main things that we kept hearing over and over were a lack of trust and confidence in the council based on their track record of how they've done things. And I think a big part that contributed to people feeling that way about this, once again, which is what we were trying to tell them in the beginning, is they should have, even if they wanted to select these certain roads from the Future Needs Committee, okay, fair enough. They should have then opened it up to community discourse so that people could maybe make their own suggestions. They should have included the citizens pretty much from as early of a time as they could. That's what they should have done. And this is what we actually went up there and asked them to do. And we were ignored 2 times on this front. So they went ahead and did it how they wanted to do it. And so that already started the distrust. And so most people felt like, here we go again. It's the same old, same old. And so that right there pretty much torpedoed it for a lot of people. And then the last thing that we kept hearing over and over from certain folks, not everybody, but from certain groups of folks were concerns about Lubbock's debt and financial situation. And I made a really long post on my page about this, and I've talked to people at length about this. When you're able to know all kind of the whole scenario about our situation, our financial situation, you really get to see that it's not in bad shape. It's just not. Lubbock has a high bond rating, which is like our credit score. I don't know about you guys, but I've never heard of anybody in bad financial shape having great credit. It just doesn't typically happen that way. And so that's a big indicator right there. The other kind of I guess, advantageous part of this would be to take advantage of the very low interest rates that are set by the Fed. Right. Historically low, one-time low, mind you, because this was done for the pandemic only. And it's pretty widely known, or it's not been set in stone, but it's pretty much widely thought that these are going to go back up in 2022, pretty early in 2022. And so we have missed that window. So we did a couple of things here where we shot ourselves in the foot. So one of them is that now the newer roads that have been built are already about to now come to a point where they need maintenance.
Yep. You
add on to that the fact that our older roads are in just horrible condition. And the last time they've actually come through and rated these.
Yep.
And they did a new updated one just recently. And our scores for all of our streets across, especially inside of the loop, are embarrassingly low.
It's called the pavement condition index.
Right.
So there's a standard way to assess the quality of roads, and many of Lubbock's roads in older areas clock in at poor or unsatisfactory when it comes to their overall maintenance.
Yeah, and so there's that. So that now you have compounding maintenance that's going to need to be done, roads that are already old that are going to get worse. And then when we do finally, as a city, decide to make the move to get funds to try to fix this stuff, we're going to not only be behind the ball, but we're going to have to pay way more to fix the same amount that they're proposing now. It's going to probably more than likely be a longer note, because we were going to have a 5-year note, which is outrageous if you know about these kind of things. And it's our money's not going to go as far, and we're going to be paying higher rates for the loan.
Right. And let's, unpack this more, because, Adam, you just laid out that on paper, this is the exact moment in time that a city like Lubbock should be doing a bond raise. Historically, Lubbock goes about 5 to 6 years between doing them. And then let's also think about this in the historic context. And I'd be curious if some listeners have any input on this too, because I've been trying to dig for when was the last time Lubbock citizens rejected a bond election, because historically Lubbock citizens understand that there's a certain amount of maintenance, there's a certain amount of, we have to eat our vegetables every now and then to make sure that the quality of our roads is maintained, because it's very costly to maintain roads. And so you typically can't do that through the operating budget of a city. You have to top that up every now and then with bond raises to allow you to be able to do this at a larger scale. And so we're looking at this, on paper, this is the exact moment we should have been doing this. In our history, we are so overdue for a bond election. And as far as I'm aware, in my lifetime, I can't think of another moment where the Lubbock citizenry so openly rejected the necessity of maintaining our roads. And I don't believe that's why they rejected it. And and Adam, I'm just curious, on paper, this should have been a home run. When it comes to what we needed, this is absolutely what we needed. How did we get here?
Well, I've been thinking about this, and one of the things that struck me is that, again, full disclosure, I am an independent voter. I'm not a member of any party, but I do know that many folks in Lubbock identify themselves as conservative. And from what I've heard from them, one of the points that they bring up often that means is fiscal responsibility. Using our finances, or basically just being good stewards of our money. And I hate to break it to those folks, but you've actually broken that value in this instance, because not doing this now means that we're going to pay much more,
right,
and get much. So we've actually, we've used our money irresponsibly here. Okay. So I hate to break it to you all. And I know that the arguments about the debt and whatnot were coming from a lot of folks who identify as conservative. But when you break it down on paper with the math, we have made a bad fiscal decision with this. I was trying to think, just like you, like, where is this coming from? I don't know if it's mixed in with the national rhetoric about inflation and all these other different things. really things that don't have anything to do with this bond election, right? Or none of that, even if there is inflation or whatever the case may be, none of that has anything at all whatsoever to do with a bond election process. And so I just honestly, that's where I kind of think maybe it was influenced from, maybe the national conversation. And, you know, I know that a lot of folks were constantly bringing up, you know, decisions of the council in the past, like Citizens Tower and things that people didn't want that they got, you know.
Right. And that's a good, you know, that's where I was going to go with this is I've seen for a lot of folks, one of the sticking points was the investment in Broadway for downtown. And there was a couple different reasons that were given, but some that I saw on some of the Facebook posts for KLBK, KCBD, a lot of people talked about how, well, who is that even for? I don't live down there. That just seems like a money pit in terms of throwing money over there. And some folks, the comments were around, you know, that's just for the rich people, right? That downtown is, there's nothing there for me. And so it looked as though that there was a very substantial portion of this bond election that in their mind was going to an area of town that was just only for the elites or for the rich or for the wealthy. And again, you know, this is about messaging, because on paper, when you try to understand how can you be a good steward of public dollars, you always want those investments to go as far as they possibly can. And there's a standard way of thinking about how a public investment in a road or road repair or maintenance, how that's going to impact the property tax base. What I can say is that in urban areas like our downtown, we know from a data perspective that when you invest in those areas, that the return you get on your investment typically justifies the payment, that you actually get a positive rate of return in property tax value for investing in core urban areas because they're dense, because the property values are higher, because you have multi-story buildings. And so again, on paper, investing in something like Lubbock's downtown actually makes a lot of sense. But when you look at the citizenry's response to this, it was hard for them to separate the downtown park, which many people view as being extravagant, the Citizens Tower project, which many people view as a misuse of funds downtown. And as a result of that, it all just got bundled together in the way that Lubbock citizens seem to be thinking about this.
Yeah, we did hear a lot of that as well. Unfortunately, I'm sorry about the lighting, Miss Isabel. I saw your comment. We'll try to get a little better with the lighting. But yeah, I did hear a lot of folks conflating that situation as far as the downtown park, which again has nothing to do with this bond, but it just happened to be the timing. They've recently been hearing about this park that they didn't want. Nobody, including us, is forgetting about Citizens Tower and how bad we didn't want that. We talk about this often because of just, you know, it seems like every time you turn around, you find out something new about the building that makes you more frustrated about it. And so we get that. But again, and I mentioned this in my post about this, I get all of that. I do. Y'all have heard me talk about it on this program. I have not changed my position on a lot of those things, but at the same time, there's instances like this where it just makes sense to do the thing, and we've got to kind of be able to separate stuff in these times because, you know, again, we've just cost ourselves more money, and also it's probably going to be exponentially more because by the time, I mean, who knows when a bond is going to be approvable, I guess, by the citizenry at large. And so by the time that happens, is that going to be 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? And then you've got compounded issues where it's just like a house. If you let a certain problem go, like a water leak, for instance, right? If you have a water leak that starts small, pretty much everybody out there understands that you better get a hold of that, because if you just let it run and keep getting worse and worse and worse, then you're going to have a huge bill versus having whatever you're going to have to spend to fix it right now. And so that's the equivalent of what we've just done. We've just let a problem go on. We've also, again, got these newer roads that were developed in a way that's not going to pay for them. And so we were able to get impact fees implemented, but that only starts from now moving forward. Right. We still have this debt from those older roads, and we're not even going to have them paid off yet by the time they're going to need repair.
And this, the last point I think for us to make on this, because of just the timing of it. So what is it? Just today, Lubbock and TxDOT broke ground on a new development project. The Outer Loop is what it has been referred to in the past, Loop 88. And so this is estimations on the high end, $10 billion project. And that is something, when you think about the bond election, a bond election is an opportunity for Lubbock citizens to have a voice and to say yes or no. We support raising lots of money to be able to make this kind of investment. A project like Loop 88, no one in Lubbock voted for. Similar to the Milwaukee build out and the use of the Gateway Fund, which was just taking money from your utility bills to pay for it, no one ever voted for Loop 88. But the thing is, Loop 88, regardless of if we do a bond election or not, regardless if we repair our roads or not, Loop 88 is happening. The monies in terms on the city side, the estimation for just the segments they're building right now is the equivalent of the bond raise. And the bond raise was supposed to go for everyone across the city of Lubbock, whereas this project and what we're putting into this is just simply going to one part of the city, a part of the city where no one lives currently. And so when we think about how are we maintaining and taking care of the things that we have, it becomes frustrating to think about, well, this feels like Lubbock citizens when it comes to the bond election, when they had the opportunity to speak out, saying we want the city of Lubbock to rethink the way that we're going about this process, the way that we're thinking about road building, the way that we're deploying this money. We want to press pause and we want to have a dialogue around this. We're tired of voting for these things over and over again every single year and seeing as though it seems to be counterproductive because our roads just get worse over and over again. And then we have something like today where we are building entirely new roads in extremely expensive roads for places where people don't live. So these are not actually servicing any of the people who currently live here. And we're paying very large sums of money to build them.
Yeah. And another thing, and I guess we can end the conversation on this note. Another thing that I often hear from folks in Lubbock, from certain sections of folks in Lubbock, there is a certain disdain for Austin, the city of Austin, right? From large parts of our community. The interesting thing, though, is what we've literally just done by voting this down is put ourselves on track to be Austin. And let me explain what I'm talking about. So my mom has lived in Austin since I was 10 years old. And so we visited there frequently over the years. And I've heard from citizens in Austin over the years that the reason why it is so horrible to drive around in Austin, and a lot of you have been there, you know what I'm talking about. You have these little tiny roads that are like, there's thousands of cars an hour probably going over these roads. And it's because as the city was growing so fast, they did not invest properly in the infrastructure as the city was growing. And that's literally what we've just set ourselves up to do, because we are growing. And that's the thing that we have to understand is that Lubbock is not a small town anymore.
Right.
It's just not, and it's not going to be. And matter of fact, why would you want it to be? Anything that's not growing is dying.
Right.
You can
look at the census data to see that.
Right.
Lubbock is the only century city in the High Plains that in any way had growth, right? Our region is collapsing in terms of population. Some of them are coming here, and that's what helped us in our growth, and others are moving to the metroplexes.
Yeah. And so, there again, and I say these things because, again, a lot of folks that I've come across, a lot of folks that I know identify as conservatives. And in this instance, many of them have voted against what they say their values are. And so it's very interesting to me. I'm really confused about it. It's not the ideal, but it is what it is. The voters who came out have spoken. I will always respect that and respect the process. And so this is another important reason of why voter turnout is so important. And we spoke about this leading up to the bond election, and quite a few people did come out. And matter of fact, I would like to drop a tidbit here. So I was talking to the city manager earlier this morning at the groundbreaking for Loop 88. And he had asked me if I had a chance to look at the precinct by precinct vote for the election yet. And I told him I hadn't. And he was very excited to tell me that, because they know that we were in favor of this, and they know that we've been everywhere I've been going, I've been talking about it and trying to just educate people on it.
Same.
And so he said that the majority of East Lubbock overwhelmingly voted for it.
Wow.
And so I'm happy to hear that. I'm so thankful that the folks in the East Lubbock voting precinct stood up to do their part on this. And I know there's people from all over. He didn't mention any of those other areas, and I haven't had a chance to look at the data, but I was very excited to hear that a lot of the folks, at least maybe heard our information and thought it made sense.
Right. And I that goes to saying something, right? When we're talking about the communities that voted overwhelmingly in support of this bond election, these are communities that historically are the ones that have given the resources for road projects. And yes, some of these road projects did touch on some of our traditional minority neighborhoods in North and East Lubbock, but this was widely distributed for everyone. And for them to say, yes, we will continue to play our role, we will continue to play our part in making sure that all of the city of Lubbock is maintained. That's what that vote was for, was the recognition of that we have a responsibility to each other. And I think that just speaks volumes to the community and their willingness to continue to engage despite school closures, which we're about to talk about, despite resource diversion from their neighborhoods, despite having the greatest number of dirt streets in the city of Lubbock out of any areas, that they continue to say that they want to play a constructive role in our city.
Yeah, and that's just what we have to continue to do. And that's a perfect segue to go into what we're about to talk about, because another thing that is the enemy of revitalization is taking out neighborhood schools from a neighborhood. And so we spoke about this. We had a guest, Miss Leah, who is a parent at Dupre Elementary.
So eloquent.
Yeah. Great conversation. When you get a chance, I encourage you to go look at last week's show. We have a lot more kind of background information, but what we're going to touch on here today is the meeting that we spoke about was coming up on the last show. That has now happened on this past Monday at 5:30 at Dupre in the cafeteria. And so quite a bit of showing. A lot of people showed up.
Oh yeah, this was, so I've been able to participate in some of these conversations in the past around what to do with troubled schools. Attended the Dunbar meetings whenever that school was being transferred, whenever they were considering to either close it or transfer it over to the Lubbock Promise Network like it is today. And what I will say is that since the neighborhood has understood the threat that has come to them, the closure of their school, the community engagement, whether it be the families, whether it be neighbors, whether it be, there was a 90-year-old alumni of Dupre that attended this event. The turnout for this, it was so clear how engaged, how turned on, how just on point the neighborhood is in recognizing the threat that is coming to their neighborhood. And it's something that I wish every neighborhood had the opportunity to do. And credit to Lala Chavez for essentially trying to put the brakes on this process and demand transparency, and that the neighborhood needed to be engaged. Because if we hadn't gotten to that point, the only thing that LASD had done up until this stage was a very discreet community meeting where they said nothing about what it was about or anything like that. And so no one knew. And credit to Trustee Lala Chavez, who wanted this to be more of a process and made enough noise where the neighborhood was able to wake up and recognize the issue that was at hand. And so to me, it was an incredible show of support, as well as the level of commitment that families in the heart of Lubbock neighborhood have to their school.
Yeah. And before we start getting into kind of what happened at the meeting, because it's going to be a little disheartening for folks who aren't aware of what happened yet. Before we get into that, I do want to kind of encourage everybody to stay engaged with this issue, because we are not letting, first of all, it has to stop now. Closing schools has to stop now. If we're not able to keep Dupre from closing this time, we have to continue and make sure that no other schools in this city are closed. The effects of this are well known. We have plenty of examples in our city from the year 2000, if you want to go back that far, to understand that whatever cost, which is very minimal, and we'll get into that, whatever cost there is to keep Dupre open, closing it is much greater of a cost. And it's not just financial cost, it's cost to quality of life for people, because in the Dupre community, a large part of them are considered by the LISD as economically disadvantaged. And me coming from a background of being economically disadvantaged, I can tell you what happens. Folks have their life constructed just so that they can get their kids to and from school and get themselves to and from work and try to make it all happen. That's just what it is. It's not a situation like most folks in our community who are middle class or higher. It's just not. It's not the same. You don't have the same resources to do things. You don't have the same time to do things. And a lot of times, just depending on what kind of work they do, a lot of times you just don't have the energy to do, much about anything else other than trying to keep your household going. And that's not an excuse for anybody. It's just the reality of a lot of folks. And it's not to say that they're not trying to raise their position or anything of that nature. It just is what it is. I can tell you, when I was in a different economic situation, I can tell you that there was decisions that I could not make. They weren't even options, just because I didn't have the means or whatever, what have you. And so, and even if you go back further in my history, I didn't even have the wherewithal, because when you come from an economically disadvantaged background, especially if it's been generational like mine, the education level is different. Right. The experience level is different. It's just different on so many levels. And it's really, really hard for folks to understand if you've grown up, for instance, your entire life in, say, a middle class even household, which a lot of folks in the middle class would say, well, I'm not rich. And you're right, but there's many folks living on half or less than what you're living on, and may have 1, 2, 3, 4 children. And so everybody's situation is different. And so these are things that need to be taken into consideration outside of just the money. And so I was really disappointed by this meeting and how it went. So when I walked in, Dr. Rollo was already kind of addressing the crowd, kind of trying to figure out where everybody was from, who was from the neighborhood, who was not. And then after all of that, she gets into her presentation, which was pretty much just a bunch of slides in defense of the position of closing the school.
And they provided, so I would say there were 2 slides that you could consider to have quote unquote data. The first was to show the gradual decline of enrollment in Dupre over many, many years. And there was a dashed line at the 200 student mark to show that the school had gotten below 200 this year. The other data point was a very simplistic image of a tiny community elementary school, which to me is the appropriate model, and this gigantic, large, 600 maximum security elementary school model, and saying that LISD experiences $1,500 in cost savings on average when they transitioned to that model. And those were the only two data points that were actually in the presentation that you could say, okay, let's get down to brass tacks and let's have an honest conversation about it. Those were the only two things that were actually mentioned for the community to have anything to digest. And that's, I think, how the conversation became so confused for the people there, was because there was nothing to go off of. It felt as though this was window dressing, and there wasn't actually any substance to the presentation that was being given and to justify why their school was being closed.
Yeah, and another interesting thing that I saw was the principal for Brown, and I don't know her. I'm sure she's a very nice lady. So I'm not bagging on her at all, but she was allowed to speak because Brown is going to be one of the proposed receiver schools. So if they close the school, the kids and the staff supposedly, allegedly, will go to Brown, or they may have an option to go to Carmona Harrison, which is 3 miles away. Again, going into all of that, people would have to rearrange their entire lives to make this happen. But I did notice that the principal for Dupre was not allowed to speak.
Yeah, right. Interesting that the principal whose school is being closed actually was not allowed to be able to provide any comment or their insights or thoughts on this, despite the meeting itself happening inside of their school.
Yeah, and then pretty immediately in the conversation, because as Dr. Rollo was going through this, and people, in my estimation, in my opinion, I should say, I think that folks were more than generous with their time, but they weren't buying it. They weren't buying the presentation. And so they let her go on for a bit, but folks, started to kind of give responses to her about certain things. And that was pretty early on in the conversation. And the thing, and I've never met President of LISD, Zach Brady, but he did not, this was not a good showing for him. I'll just put it that way. So he was up, at one point he was up on his feet yelling at people, yelling at one person, then quickly swiveling around, yelling at another, swiveling back around, yelling at a third. It was bad. And it was to a point to where I had to respectfully ask him to kind of relax, and not so many words, because I was like, this is really not a good look right now, so he did kind of simmer down from that point on. But even in that, both from him and Dr. Rollo, who were the ones mostly answering or responding to questions and concerns, though they said in the beginning that we're here to listen, they had a defense to every single comment and question that was made. That was a red flag to me, because to me, when you say you're there to listen, you're not talking as much. It just doesn't make sense. If you're there to listen, you're talking very little. And especially if you're listening to hear. If you're listening to respond, that's something different, and that's not a conversation. That is a decree coming from LISD. Right. And this is what they were kind of not picking up on, this energy in the room, it seemed. And I kind of had to let them know, like, this is not people's first rodeo. Right. They're fed up with this. They're not going to accept the answer that you have given them, because you have not provided satisfactory data to say beyond a reasonable doubt, why should this school close? Right.
There were even people in the audience who were there from other neighborhoods that had experienced elementary school closures, because of how strongly they felt that they had been misled about the value of it, because they felt as though that their children were not honored or cherished in the way that LISD said that they would be. And so even within the audience itself, there were people who were still carrying the pain and the trauma of elementary school closures, to the point where they came to this meeting to be able to speak on behalf of the Dupre parents to say you can't, this is the same song and dance that we heard, and the outcomes of it were bad ultimately. And when you're getting that level of community support for folks to want to drive across town, this was at 5:30. For some people, this is a tough meeting to get to. Just simply to be able to say that and to say, don't buy into this. You have to peel back. You can't just take what they're saying at face value. You have to push. You have to ask questions, because otherwise you can be being led down a path that maybe some parts of it sound well and good, but that's not there's no contract there. Kathy Rollo is not going to ink some agreement with the neighborhood to say, I'm going to commit to all the things that I just promised you. There's no mechanism for accountability. And so even if they sell you the world during these meetings, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll do any single part of it.
Yeah. And so the big argument from LISD that we heard at the meeting and that we heard prior to the meeting was that it was purely an economical decision, purely had to do with money and trying to be good stewards, according to them, of the LISD's resources. And so the argument is that when you have a school that's at about 200 students like Dupre, the cost is, and I'm just kind of rounding here, it was like $6,500 per student. That's the cost per student. And then if you have these students at a school where it's say 500 or 600, like Brown, then the cost per student is about $1,500 less. Again, $1,500 per student for 200 students is not a whole lot of money to save the LISD, number one. Number two, there have been a couple of meetings at the school between LISD and staff, and one of those had to deal with specifically the effects of coming out of the pandemic and how it had an effect on learning outcomes of children and what they were going to do for that. And so I say that to remind everybody that we are actually trying to build back from a pandemic. I don't know if everybody forgot, but that was just last year. And so we're trying to build back from a pandemic. I don't understand what part of building back is closing a school. So again, you've got different things going on here just outside of this $1,500 difference. And so that was one of the meetings. Another meeting was presented, how they heard it, presented to staff and parents as Dupre was going to have 4 years to turn around academic performance and different things that were going on at the school. So they were going to have a year of planning and 3 years to actually carry out the plan. And then they would, I guess, take next steps after that. This was very recently. And then all of a sudden they pop up saying they were going to close the school. So there's questionable things going on here. They didn't really have good answers to those, to really any of the questions. And my main argument, because I knew that they were going to limit us in time, and so I kind of had to pick what I wanted to deal with in there. And so I went right to the heart of the argument. If you're saying that keeping Dupre open, in essence, is going to cause financial hardship for the district, that's basically what they're saying. You're saying if we leave the school open, we're worse off financially than if we close it. So the problem with that is that when you look at the financial management report for LISD, and this deals mostly with funds concerning enrollment. It's not really, it doesn't have anything to do with academic performance or anything. It's strictly dealing with the money, because that's what they said. They said this is all about the money. All right, great. So let's look at the money. So LISD right now currently has an A or superior rating for their financial management. It's the highest that you can achieve. A passing score for a district would be a 60. LISD currently has 100. And there's an indicator in there, indicator number 8, that specifically speaks to long-term solvency. And it basically says, in much more words, it basically says, is the district basically, is it in good enough shape to keep its long-term solvency. So like, do you have money enough to keep yourself going in the long term? And if the district as a whole in the last 5 years has increased enrollment by 7% or more, they automatically pass this indicator. So they passed it. There was actually pushback from Zach Brady on this when I brought this up, and he said, no, our enrollment hasn't gone up. And so I said, so you falsified records then? And he said, no. And then he gave some explanation that didn't make a whole lot of sense. And so I asked them to provide data to the public that says, if we close or if we leave Dupre open, can you show data that will show that it will drop our financial management rating? That's number one. Number two is that in the American Rescue Plan Act, and also in the other two stimulus packages that happened in the last year, school systems got money. And as part of that. So of course you had the stimulus checks, you had the EIDL loans, the PPP loans, and all those kind of things, but also schools got money. And LISD in this last round of the American Rescue Plan Act received $75 million. And this is specifically to be used for, like Dr. Rollo called them, wraparound services, which, social emotional services. For instance, they said they don't have a full-time counselor in Dupre. These funds can be used to get you a full-time counselor at Dupre. These funds can be used for programs to bring students to the school if you wanted to do that and have them bust in from other places. There's all sorts of uses you can use for this money, and it's $75 million. I mean, you should be able to keep all of our schools open for that amount.
Right, and and to go on these numbers, one of the parents that spoke up, Leah, who was so eloquent when she challenged some of the very limited numbers that LISD was actually providing the community. And one of the points that she made was, when you're even talking about the cost savings of closing Dupre, is it appropriate to compare the average cost per enrollment across the LISD wide versus, shouldn't we be comparing this apples to apples, and shouldn't we be comparing the average cost for elementary school students, which is $7,000, and not the $5,000 average, which makes sense. Junior highs are larger, high schools are even larger. And so she pointed out, why are we suddenly, whenever LISD is coming to us and making this justification that they're going to save $1,500 per student, which when you think about 200 students, that's the salary of a well-paid doctor in the city of Lubbock, is effectively what LISD will save by destroying the oldest school in the district. Why is it that you're not even giving us an apples to apples comparison when it comes to these numbers? Right? Why is it that we're having to essentially challenge you on this and say, wait, this comparison is not appropriate. This isn't apples to apples. You're diluting the cost per student by blending junior high prices and high school prices into this total number. How does that appropriate when we're thinking about specifically in elementary school and the cost that it takes to maintain that? And I would also say, okay, so LISD would technically save, quote unquote, $300,000 for doing this. But there's two elements to the story that are confusing. One is that LISD is supposedly promising that Dupre won't be closed. It will still be used as a facility.
As some sort of vocational.
Right. So why not just keep it as a school?
Right.
And then the other is, do we think that $300,000 worth of property tax damage in revenues is going to happen as a result of the Dupre closure? And I can tell you, looking at the various neighborhoods that have lost their elementary schools, yes, it will be more profound than the savings that LISD is going to get from this, essentially making their operating budget looking slightly better. And so why is it that people in the neighborhood are having to do open information records requests? Why they're having to essentially drive to LISD central office to try to demand this information, right? Just to be on fair ground when it comes to this community dialogue, right? How is that listening? How is that a meaningful engagement when you're getting called out and effectively using misleading numbers by the neighborhood because they've had to become so savvy about these things in 2 weeks time.
Yeah, right. And the bottom line is really this, honestly. I was looking through the LISD Board of Trustees handbook, if you will. They have all the rules and things that kind of dictate how you're supposed to operate if you're a school board trustee. And one of those things in the ethics section is that you're supposed to work with the community. You're supposed to include them in decisions and discussions. And that has not only has that not happened, as Nick just stated, it's a little tough to get information from LISD, to put it mildly. It's a little tough to get information. I sent a couple of open records requests yesterday. The first email that was on the website was not the correct one.
Yeah, it bounced. The contact information listed of who you're supposed to send email requests to bounced.
Yeah, and so I saw the title of the person whose email that was and looked up to see who the new person was and sent it to her and asked her, if this is not the right department, can you please forward it to the right one? So she emailed me back and said, oh, well, you need to use this form and you need to send it to this other email. So, I mean, it's, again, that to me is a red flag when you're talking about you're working with somebody, and the same thing happened in the meeting that where, again, they had a defense for everything. And then after a time, and I don't even think it was even close to an hour yet, Dr. Rollo just announced, oh, well, I'm just going to only take 3 more questions. I'm not going to take any more questions.
And then if you have any other things you want to say, you can give public comment at 7 a.m. on
the 11th,
on the day where was your school, right? Because because the public, because we know from experience, whenever you're told, oh, just give it in public comment, it'll be fine, right? Historically, whether it be the city council or whether it be the school board, the public comment time is not the moment where dialogue is possible. The minds of these individuals was already made up way in advance. And it showed because there were multiple instances where parents within the neighborhood offered creative ideas and solutions to this problem. And every single one of them was essentially negated just simply as a defensive maneuver. So one great example, parents within the neighborhood mentioned, well, if you just simply didn't cut out 30th to 34th Street out of the Dupre neighborhood area, right? So this is our neighborhoods are 1 square mile, right? So they're 1 mile by 1 mile. So heart of Lubbock, the bottom part of it, 30th Street to 34th Street, those children cross 34th Street to get to their school instead of actually being able to go to Dupre. And so people said, well, why not just simply have the whole neighborhood get to go to Dupre? And Dr. Rollo's response was, well, it's been like that forever, as though that was the comment. Right? What the parents are asking is, can we think together about creative solutions, or in my mind, reasonable solutions?
Right.
It seems like a kid who lives in a neighborhood should be able to go to the school in their neighborhood. And in the same way, Dr. Rollo offered, oh, if your children go 3 miles north to this new elementary school that we're building, guess what? They will finally be inside of the Lubbock High feeder pattern instead of going to Monterey, so that kids who are growing up in heart of Lubbock, now when they grow up, they'll finally get to go to Lubbock High, the high school that's across the street from them, instead of going to Monterey. But from my perspective, why are those kids even going to Monterey now? Right? There are so many strange and bizarre ways that we have structured the school district that are not for the benefit of the communities, that are not for the benefit of the neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. There's some kind of shell game that LISD has sort of played in the way that they've structured these. I agree. It is ridiculous for a child to be able to see a high school from their house and not be able to attend it. That's ridiculous. Yeah. Why is it that LISD, their unwillingness to think about reasonable solutions to their manufactured problem, which was that Dupre went below 200 students this year. And that was the arbitrary cutoff that they decided justified the closure.
But I asked her specifically about this. This
Right.
is one of the questions I had because I got conflicting information.
Right.
At first, we were hearing the threshold was 200. Another trustee told me that it was 300. So I asked them in the meeting directly, is there a threshold? Well, she jumped at answering. I said, is there a threshold, an official threshold? And she said, no, there is not. There is no magic number. And so why is 196 the cutoff?
Right.
There's no reasoning.
And not only that, why did you put a dotted line on 200 students in your Dupre enrollment graph? It what does it
mean? Something.
Like it means something.
Yeah.
If it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't mean anything, right? You're just making up justifications as to why you're going to close a school. And not only that, but when parents offered the idea of, well, let's include 30th to 34th Street into our catchment area. And Rollo's response was, well, there's not enough kids over there. There's not 4 kids.
Right.
We're in 4 blocks worth of a 1 square mile neighborhood. There's not one family in there.
There's got to be at least 50 houses there.
Right.
At least.
And it's just sort of like, well, what, okay, the target is moving, right? You keep the goalposts are moving, right. And it was every opportunity for the parents to say, look, let's work with us. Here's an idea. Here's something, here's a solution. Here's a reasonable way that Dupre could stay open. There was some kind of deflection or some kind of already prepared talking point as to why that was impossible. As though allowing kids in heart of Lubbock to go to Lubbock High is impossible. As though having children who live in that neighborhood on the southern part of it going to Dupre is impossible because it's always been that way. Well, change it. Save the community elementary school. Understand the value that it has. Can you not see that from the level of engagement that these parents are having? And I come back to this. There was a 90-year-old alumni that was at this meeting who stood up and spoke and advocating on behalf of the neighborhood, advocating for the families in the neighborhood. These schools mean so much more than just simply being a school. What they represent to our communities, they are critical to the fabric of the neighborhoods. They are what they are the history carriers, the cultural anchors to the neighborhoods. It's why parents from other neighborhoods who had their elementary schools closed came to this to speak out against this policy because of how destructive it has been over and over again. And it's just, how is it that we can't learn from the past, right? It's not as though this hasn't happened enough where we can say, wow, we have a lot of data as to how damaging this is to the overall longevity of a neighborhood. Yeah. Maybe we should stop doing it.
Yeah. And so what we'll leave off with is a call to action, if you will, because this is literally one of the reasons why Lubbock Compact was created. This is not something that we're going to give up on. This is not something that I'm going to give up on.
It has to end.
Yeah, it has to end. We have to stop closing schools now. And so now that we've made that resolution, this is what we are going to do. And I'm going to get this going online as soon as I possibly can get it up. But we will have a petition going around. What the petition will be about is no more school closures. And I would like as many people as possible to share it. Of course, sign it, have your friends share it. It'll be all online. It should be very quick and easy to do. And just to show numbers of the people who are on this same wave, if you will. And what the signing the petition will be doing is basically making a pledge amongst ourselves that any board of trustee members that vote to close a school, that vote yes to close a school from this point forward, that we're making a pledge to vote against them in the next election. And this is our last recourse. And it's honestly sad that we have to go this route, because I would much rather have an adult conversation and an adult discussion and to look at data and look at options. And I would love to do all of that. And in an ideal world, that would work. And you think that it would work here. But since it's not, and since we all know how destructive this is, and because communities do not want this, and LISD, don't let them fool you, their charge is to work with the community. That is their charge. And if they're not willing to do that, and they're going to go against what folks want, then that's grounds for being removed from that office. And so we've got to get serious about this, which I know that we already are. The community is definitely. And so we're going to get this going, and it's going to be the No More School Closures campaign. We are going to try to make this flood the city and get as many signatures on this thing before the 11th that we can, to show them on the 11th, show them how many people do not agree with this. Regardless of your reasoning, regardless of your numbers, we do not agree with this. We need you to come to the table and discuss something different. And at that point, each and every one of those trustees can make their decision. Do I vote for this and play my hand against these people who are fed up with this? Or do I just do what I want to do? You know, they're going to have to make that decision.
Right. And this issue is bigger than Heart of Lubbock and Dupre, because at some point we have to see the history of this and to understand how self-destructive it has been to the city of Lubbock. Why is it that Lubbock Cooper Friendship and New Deal, which actually just passed a large bond election for them to build
almost 50 million,
right, to renovate their schools and to build a new high school? Why is it that everyone around us is growing? Why is it that they're all increasing their families? Could it be that when we get rid of our neighborhood elementary schools, that there's no longer a reason for families to move into those neighborhoods and to live in those neighborhoods? And so while it's Dupre today, we could have had this conversation in 2002 when it was Stubbs. We could have had this conversation in 2010 when it was Tubbs. We could have had this conversation in 2015 when it was Isles. We could have had this conversation in 2011 when it was the Arnett Elementary School. We could have had it in 2014 when it was the Parkway Elementary School. We could have had it in 2014 again when it was Bozeman, in 2013 when it was Murphy, in 2014 again when it was Haynes, and then in 2020 when it was Guadalupe, Jackson, and Wright. This can't keep going. What is happening is we are destroying the community fabric that keeps our neighborhoods thriving, that creates reasons for why families want to come into these neighborhoods, right? We can't keep doing this and expect that the result is going to be different.
Yeah, so that's what we will leave you with, folks. We are going to continue to stand alongside this community and any other community who is facing this. And I will tell you right now, if you don't think that this can come to you, and very soon, I will present something to you that hopefully will open your eyes to the fact that this can happen. Now, on an academic performance level, right now as we speak, there are at least 10 schools that are operating at what's called an unacceptable level. So at any point in time, LISD could say, you know what, this school is operating too low, or whatever the case may be, and they could come for any one of those 10 schools next. And when I tell you they're all across the city, they are all across the city. This is not, again, I am such a passionate, loud voice on this because I'm from East Lubbock. I saw it. Many people in Lubbock Compact are from North Lubbock. They saw it. And so that's why there were so many of us in that meeting standing with you all, because we've seen this movie over and over again. And we know what it does. And no, we may not know everybody in the community, but we empathize with you and we know what you're going through. And so we will be here with you, and we are going to continue this campaign, the No More School Closures campaign. We have to let ISD know and put them on notice. Do what you want, make the decisions you want to do. But if you vote yes to close another school, we will see you at the ballot box. And with that, we will be right back here next time. And thank you everybody for tuning in. And please share the video with all your friends and stay in contact with Lubbock Compact on Facebook and all the other things.